name is Wendy Schiller. I'm a professor of political science and international and public affairs, and I'm the interim director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Today marks the beginning of a conversation series we're hosting on policy outlooks for 2025, and today's subject is immigration and border politics. We're very fortunate to have two esteemed scholars with us today to engage in the conversation. Peter Andreas is a political scientist and author of Border Games, The Politics of Policing the U.S.-Mexico Divide, and his work examines the complex dynamics of border enforcement and the political economy of migration. And Ieva Jusionyte, an anthropologist whose research focuses on the intersections of security, violence, and humanitarianism along borders, has particular expertise on the U.S.-Mexico border. Her most recent book is entitled Exit Wounds: How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border. Today, they'll be sharing their insights into policies, challenges, and human stories shaping these critical issues. So we'll start with one question for each of our esteemed scholars. And we'll hold to some time limits here. Could each of you explain or give an overview of the last 30 years of the U.S. history on the southern border? So how about we start with Professor Jusionyte?
Well, that's a big question, but we can see a lot of continuity in the last 30 years. So if we go back to the 1990s, that's where the militarization and fortification of the border really began under Clinton administration. The idea was that people are coming into the United States because it is very easy to get here. So the Border Patrol created this program called Prevention Through Deterrence, which meant we will deploy more Border Patrol agents in cities where people come across. We'll build more border fences. And then that increased after 9/11. So in early 2000s, when Bush came to power, the Secure Fence Act was signed, the Department of Homeland Security was created, migration was moved from the Department of Justice to the Department of Homeland Security as their prerogative, and there were more border walls and border fences built. And this has continued. So through the Obama administration, the first Trump administration and Biden administration, although there was more Border Patrol agents and more border walls being built, but the same continuity in seeing the border as a source of threats coming to the United States, both people who do not have documents, drugs, potentially terrorists, and as a response, militarization of that border.
Well, that is a sweeping and succinct history. So, Professor Andreas?
Yeah, I'll actually tell the same story, but Ieva described it as continuity, and I would actually describe it as transformation. But it's the same story going back to the 90s. And it's really two parallel stories. We tend to emphasize one or the other, but the two stories are, on the one hand, creating a barricaded border, and the other hand, a borderless economy. So NAFTA is happening at precisely the same time as the U.S. is ramping up immigration and drug controls on the border. And so there's this kind of celebratory, post-Cold War rhetoric of borders are passé, walls are passé, more integration, more interdependence, and NAFTA was sort of this symbol of a bright, optimistic future in U.S.-Mexico relations. And at the same time, the U.S., partly reaction to an anti-immigration backlash in California in the early 90s, was starting to a process that it was really pioneering. The Democrats were the pioneers of tougher border enforcement in the 90s. Clinton actually, won Orange County for the first time in 1996. Partly by out-toughing his Republican competitors on the border issue. So Democrats won the out-toughing game in the 1990s. And then after 9/11, basically there was consensus across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats alike, for more border security. This was important. It was easy money politically to promise more border security. At the same time, respecting Mexico as an important economic partner, one of the country's three, biggest trading partners. And so there's a simultaneous opening the border and closing it at the same time. Lots of fence construction. The Border Patrol was doubled in the 90s and then doubled again, actually, in the first decade of the century. So lots of hiring going on. Actually, the biggest challenge was getting enough people to apply for the job. They would hire a consulting agency, a job with borders but no boundaries was the slogan they tried to get people to apply, and call this 800 number and so on. And the bringing in, military resources and technologies and so on for border enforcement. So there was a militarization in some ways of the border, mostly focused on immigration, but also very much a drug enforcement operation. Some drug funds were actually used to build the border fence, even though the primary function of the fence turns out to be immigration control. So that brings us up to the Trump years. And, Trump somehow convinced people that the border was wide open and that he was the first person to get tough on border enforcement. There was this kind of historical amnesia. There had been decades of building up border enforcement, but he basically wanted to out-tough everybody and said, I'm going to build a wall. And no one had used the wall language before. Everyone had called it fencing. It was diplomatically, nicer to call it a fence. Mexico immediately reacted negatively to the wall language. It's interesting, in the 90s, Pat Buchanan tried to use the wall language, but it was too close to the crumbling of the Berlin Wall. People were kind of like, walls? We're not about walls these days, so fencing was okay. But years later, the political climate had changed, and Trump said, nope, I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to be the first person to do it. In practice, what's the difference between fencing and a wall? It's kind of a bit arbitrary. If you look up the definition, sometimes they kind of overlap. And what he ended up doing actually in office, that was the cornerstone of his campaign, right? And so he immediately was under pressure to fulfill that campaign promise of building a wall. It became a stalemate in Congress. He diverted military resources actually to build it. Mostly he reinforced pre-existing barriers. Right. And what really drew attention, and there was a serious backlash politically, was the family separation policy at the border. I mean, the border wall really was political, a win for him. But family separation, there was a backlash. Even members of his own family pushed back. And so he basically backed off. And so, we'll get to the present, but the real question, I think, for us here is sort of to what extent can he do family separation now on a nationwide scale, because it didn't work actually right at the border.
So when we think, Ieva, Professor Jusionyte, about the porousness of the border, of the U.S.-Mexico border, a lot of people see people coming over, and they wonder, we always hear these numbers, millions. And if you go all the way back to the 1980s for the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, which provided amnesty to people who would come here without documentation. And then that was supposed to sort of stem the tide. But of course, that didn't stem the tide. So what I want to say to you and want to get a sense of is what else crosses the border? In other words, we've seen human crossing, but what else crosses the border? And we know that with the trade deals, commerce crosses the border. But what other kinds of things cross the border, and how has that made it harder to get a handle on what we call border control?
So basically, my answer can build off of what Professor Andreas said before. With NAFTA, what happened is, yes, we got much more produce coming from Mexico, but with that produce, what also came to the United States is also much more drugs. The United States has been mostly concerned with what is coming into the United States from Mexico. So it has been people, as well as drugs. The numbers are very deceiving when we are talking about illicit economies, because we only get the sense of what is being seized at the border. So how many drugs the Border Patrol or the Customs and Border Protection seizes. 90% of them come through ports of entry. So they do come with these trucks bringing vegetables, or with the passenger vehicles that come through into the United States, thousands and thousands a day. They can't all be stopped and checked if we don't want to halt all this NAFTA-enabled commerce. But then we also often don't talk about what is going in the opposite direction. So in the opposite direction go the guns and the money. And guns is a big priority for the Mexican government. It has been for a few years now and even longer, because Mexico has very strict gun laws and US has very weak ones, especially in states bordering Mexico, like Texas and Arizona, where most, over 50% of all guns recovered in crime scenes in Mexico come from. So there is this vicious kind of circle or exchange of guns going south, people fleeing violence, coming north to seek asylum. There is also the same guns are implicated in violence that drug trafficking organizations engage in. And it is very hard to kind of stop this, because we want the legal commerce to be allowed to continue, and also because there is asymmetry. So there is demand on one side. In the United States, there is a demand for drugs because there is an addiction epidemic. In Mexico, there is a demand for guns because it is very difficult to find guns locally, and there is a lot of demand among organized crime groups, but also people who do not trust local law enforcement and want guns to protect themselves. So it's reinforcing this bad situation, and yeah, that's where we are.
So, Professor Andreas, can we talk a little bit about this? It seems that you did a great job of framing what the Clinton administration did in the 90s and the coincidence with trade and opening up trade. So if you're somebody who remembers the 80s, it was about cocaine and marijuana, right? And then you go to the 90s and it was about Colombia. Right, any movie you saw was always about Colombia or Bolivia, even in the older days, and then it was marijuana from Mexico. How has the shifting nature of what kind of drugs are produced and come over the border changed since the 1990s? Because now we seem to talk about nothing but fentanyl. And where is the sort of center of activity that's producing those drugs coming over?
Well, in some ways, this is a story of continuity in the sense that Mexico, having the misfortune of being right next door to the world's largest illicit drug market in terms of consumers, has always been a gateway for drugs consumed in the U.S. The question is how much, which drugs, exactly how it's organized, who the traffickers are, and so on. But Mexico just is almost, geography is destiny. It's going to play that role to some extent. It was true with alcohol prohibition, actually, back in the 1920s, right? The big change from my perspective is, and this was a real game changer, was in the 70s and into the early 80s, the main gateway to the U.S. for Colombian cocaine was through South Florida and the Southeast. And the U.S. actually did a pretty good job of putting up an interdiction net there. Didn't stop it, though. It pushed the flow westward towards Mexico. It grounded it, was coming on through small planes, and it was coming on through boats, and now it grounded it, so it was coming in through border ports of entry in the U.S.-Mexico border at precisely the same time that the U.S. is having a sort of boom in commercial traffic with Mexico. And so this was a godsend for Mexican trafficking organizations who were suddenly the transporters for the Colombian traffickers, and they not only were transporting it for them, but actually distributing it too in the United States increasingly. So the big change was Mexico becoming the lead entry point for not only cannabis, marijuana, but also cocaine. Mexico had long been a producer of heroin, but the big game changer was cocaine. Interestingly enough, another change was that methamphetamines had been significantly domestically produced in the U.S., but the DEA successfully cracked down on some of the precursor chemicals for that. And so the reaction of the trade was to push it over the border to Mexico. And so then Mexico is a beneficiary of U.S. crackdowns domestically. And so a lot of the methamphetamines are imported from Mexico, thanks to the so-called success of the U.S. drug war domestically. So Mexico now is major exporter of cannabis, though competing to be honest, the biggest competitors are domestic U.S. cannabis producers. There's kind of pot protectionism at the border unintentionally, right? They're actually pretty good at stopping pot because it's bulkier and smells more. The dogs can catch it more. So Mexican cannabis producers are in decline. And U.S. producers have enjoyed pot protectionism, and now it's legal in many states, right? So Colorado can illegally supply Kansas, right? So still an exporter of cannabis to the U.S., still an exporter of heroin to the U.S. Cocaine it's the main gateway still, and methamphetamines, and now, of course, fentanyl. In fact, increasingly, the chemicals needed to manufacture it imported from China, but then processed in Mexico into fentanyl and coming across the border into the U.S. Of course, fentanyl is implicated in the U.S. opioid epidemic, one of the biggest killer of. Right. Well, it's gone down a bit now, but actually, in recent years, record overdose deaths in the U.S.
So for both of you, I'll start with Professor Jusionyte. When you think about the human toll of the porousness of our border, you've mentioned that all these guns that go from the United States to Mexico and then, of course, go anywhere else all over the world. What is the human toll for this sort of interchange, the porousness of the border in terms of a commerce, whether it's illegal or illicit commerce or legal commerce? What are we seeing? Because the rhetoric that we have is that it's the undocumented people or migrants who are the threat. But in this conversation, it's clear that the gun industry in the United States is supported by its trafficking south. And the drug industry that kills 100 to 110,000 people, as you said, Professor Andreas, a year from overdoses and addiction is sort of really also supported and perpetuated by the porous border. So could you take that question?
Who's the director of that?
Professor Jusionyte about guns and then Professor Andreas about drugs. Yeah.
The human toll is really on both sides of the border. So when we talk about guns, obviously in the United States, we have a big gun violence problem and domestic violence and inner city violence and mass shootings, but also the guns that are made here or imported to the United States from Europe or other countries, they go down to primarily Mexico is the primary market, but they also go down to Central America, to the Caribbean, like Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and other countries. They do less tracing, so we don't know so much. And people from those countries are also then coming and trying to seek protection in the United States from trying to outrun that violence.
And Professor Andreas?
Yeah, we should also not lose sight of the fact that since the 90s, there was also a big spike in border deaths of migrants trying to cross the border. And this was, I would say it's anticipated but unintended consequence of U.S. policy in the sense that the strategy was to crack down on the most visible forms of migrant flows through urban areas, say San Diego, Tijuana, border area, El Paso, Juarez. And what happened is it didn't stop the flow. Those crackdowns didn't stop the flow, but it dispersed it into more difficult, out of sight, more remote, more treacherous terrain. So two things happened. More migrants were dying in the desert of dehydration and so on, hundreds every year. And we don't know the exact numbers because many of them are just never recorded, right? And also driving migrants also into the hands of human smugglers. So before, you almost self-smuggle yourself across the border in the old days. It was a luxury, kind of optional to hire a smuggler. Now that became absolutely essential to be able to cross the border. And then it's also in more difficult, treacherous terrain. And then, you have situations where the penalties are much higher than they used to be for migrant smuggling. And so smugglers have an incentive to outrun or evade the border patrol as much as possible, sometimes leaving their human cargo, if you want to call it that, in treacherous conditions where they die. So that's been clearly part of the human toll.
So sticking with you, Professor Andreas, how significant now is the shift from Trump to Biden and now back to Trump on border enforcement and immigration? And you mentioned the family separation policy, and now we've seen already ICE raids in selected areas of the country. How do you see, it's a long border, that southern border, and we have the northern border. So how do you see the second Trump administration possibly differing from the first? And sort of what are the immediate effects of the shift from Biden to Trump?
From Biden to Trump, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the Trump is many things, and one thing he clearly is a showman. So if you could think of his first administration as season one of Trump, it's all about the wall. Build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. This is the cornerstone of his campaign, and he entered office promising to do it, and so one way to describe that is it's about keeping people out. Right. And now the cornerstone of his campaign, the wall was so passe that, that's part of it, but that's not the thing he emphasized. He emphasized the largest deportation in U.S. history. So that's not about keeping them out. That's about kicking them out. Right. So in some ways, the first one is kind of defensive crackdown. It's basically hardening the border to keep people out. The second is offensive. Right? It's literally going after them and kicking them out, those who have already arrived. And, by many estimates, around, 11, 12 million people. Right? So this is extraordinarily ambitious, far more ambitious than building a wall, if you will. And the real test, and it's just too early to tell, is if you think about the family separation episode that kind of backfired. Even his own family members told him to stop it within days. In 2018, I believe it was. Well, now, if you think about 11 to 12 million people targeted, and the stories of family separation that are going to emerge across the country, Chicago, wherever, continuously, for days and weeks and months and years. I would say in some ways Trump won the border game in the sense that he got him elected, right? But he may really be overplaying his hand if he thinks he can just continuously have images of family separation as playing to his base. I mean, they call it shock and awe. Right. And it will the base will be in awe and migrant communities will be in shock. And then the question is, how's the rest of the country going to react? I think it's too early to tell. I mean, right now, the resistance to what he's been doing just in a week or so is been quite strikingly muted, I would say. But that may change. So it's far too early to tell. But one way to think about it is, the border was this thin line that he could argue to, push to prop up. But now he wants to turn the whole country into a border, right? Which is far more ambitious and divisive, arguably.
For Ieva, can we put sort of literally a human face on people who are seeking asylum? So what are the barriers to cultural adaptation, even if you get here, even if you are, given legal status for asylum? And of course, we know that there are threats by Trump right now to revoke temporary protected status for people in this country. But when people think about migrants, I think there may be old-fashioned ideas that it's Mexicans only, but we have people from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, all over. And, what does that look like to try to adapt? I mean, what kind of communities will they find that will be supportive of them, and how might that change under Trump?
So one thing that has changed because of the border enforcement and all this more difficulty to come to the United States is that while previously, yes, we have been seeing many seasonal or temporary migrants, many men, many from Mexico, in the past decade or so, what we are seeing is entire families coming, and not only from Mexico. Mexico is still the main country of origin for migrants in the United States, like by far. The second group is, at least for last year, was Venezuelans and Guatemalans and Cubans and Haitians and Hondurans further down. But it's entire families who are coming here because the breadwinner can't go to the United States, work for 2 years in construction, and then go back. They are paying to bring their children. And that's where the human toll that Peter was talking about also happens, because for families, it's more difficult to cross the border. And then when they get into the United States, often they are very well integrated into the communities where they go, because they go where there is a community, where they have aunts or family members or friends. So there are a lot of Hondurans working in Louisiana and a lot of Guatemalans in New Bedford, fishing industry, and they kind of go where they know where to go. They have a support network. Now, what this new administration is trying to do, so the same of the people who were with Trump in the first administration, like Tom Homan, he was the one who designed this family separation program. Stephen Miller is back in here. So what they are trying to do, yes, they will do these deportations, but they happen at two levels. Yes, there is a spectacle, like let's do a big workplace raid and let's show these people being put on the plane, and we don't know whether the countries will accept them, but we'll fly them, we'll show it on TV. But then what happens is other people who are not in that raid, they will be afraid. They're afraid to go to school. They're afraid to go to the hospital. They are afraid to go to work because they don't know whether some of them will be caught. And then, as the Homan was saying, well, we won't separate families. The US-born children can go back with their parents to whatever country they came from. So there is a lot of fear, and a lot of uncertainty of what will happen. And people from different countries have different legal pathway. So for many years, people from Cuba had a way to stay in the United States. Now there is such a hodgepodge of situations. Some people have temporary protected status. Some people were paroled into the country. Some people can get asylum. And all of this is being changed and scrambled, and we don't really know. There is a lot of after an executive order is being issued, there are legal lawsuits to stop that executive order. So there's a lot of uncertainty of what will happen. One of the most cruel things was that during the Biden administration, the only way to come into the United States to ask for asylum was to use this app, CBP-1, where you register for an interview at the border. And people were waiting. People were waiting for 3 months in Mexico, for 6 months, and all their appointments were just canceled overnight. You can't go in and get that asylum. There's a lawsuit. Maybe ACLU will win it. Maybe it will be reinstated. But this uncertainty is also something that's very difficult to live with.
So looking ahead and thinking about all that we've absorbed, and it's been fascinating, just thinking about the evolution of U.S. policies, but the evolution of the intersection of economic trade, of illicit gun smuggling, and migration, and thinking about how it's expanded beyond Mexico in terms of people coming over. What do you see? I mean, essentially, do you see the business community as being somewhat the savior of immigration? In other words, pushing back so hard on these draconian policies because it's undermining business and wages and labor availability? Or do you see, members of Congress trying to push back? I mean, what do you see unfolding? We're in 2025, but we're going to face a 2026 midterm election before we know it. Donald Trump is not constitutionally allowed to run for re-election, so we can't count on an electoral incentive for him to switch gears. So where do we see this happening? I think since I started with Professor Jusionyte, I'll end with Professor Andreas. So Professor Jusionyte, you want to give us your take, and then we'll end with Professor Andreas.
I think what we are already seeing now is that there is a resistance coming from state level and from local level. So there is sanctuary jurisdictions. There are certain states that don't want to cooperate with federal law enforcement in terms of deportations. How much they can do? Again, a difficult question and to be seen. But I expect to see more organizing on the local level and at the state level. At the federal level, so far, it is really difficult to say, because if we look at what happened recently, Democrats are really moving towards the Republican and Trump agenda by passing the Lake and Riley Act, for example, which was Democrats would probably not have supported something like that 10 years ago. So for me, it's hard to see where at the federal level we can find resistance, but maybe at the state level.
Thank you. Professor Andreas?
Yeah, I mean, I would, remind people that Trump is pretty obsessed with the numbers and how things look. And so his main objective in the end, ultimately, is to be able to claim that he succeeded in pulling off the biggest deportation in U.S. history. And so he would actually have to, I think Obama actually, almost 3 million people deported under Obama. That was pretty targeted deportations, not causing massive fear among immigrant communities in general. But so Trump is, my understanding is his borders are basically said realistically we're aiming at 1 million a year, and that would get him to 4 million, which would be the largest deportation ever. And so basically at a minimum, I think this is what he's going to be obsessed with achieving, is to be able to say he deported more people than any president in American history. Now, what's interesting, that's going to get the headlines. That's what he's going to emphasize repeatedly. Quietly behind the scenes, I would not be surprised at all if there's a significant increase in short-term temporary visa worker permits given out for importing seasonal labor from the very countries that he's deporting people back to. And it will not be reported as an invasion. It will not be reported hardly at all, probably. And so this will be one way to satisfy the extraordinary high demand for migrant labor in agriculture, hospitality industry, across the U.S. sectors, but some are much more migrant labor dependent than others. And so there will be pushback from employers, but part of that pushback is potentially going to be dealt with through temporary visas that is not going to get the same kind of attention that kicking people out is.
Well, that is fascinating. I think this discussion has been so instructive, and I really appreciate your time. I want to thank Professor Peter Andreas, who's a political scientist, Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs at Brown, and Professor Ieva Jusionyte, who's Professor of Anthropology and Political and International and Public Affairs. And we will continue these conversations across a lot of different issues. And I think we'll have to come back to you too in a couple of months and revisit and see where we are. But thank you so much for your time.